Imagine you're suspended high in the air by heavy, rusted iron chains. The cold metal bites deeply into your wrists and ankles, locking your body into a rigid, completely helpless posture. Below you, the heat is suffocating. It rises in thick, wet waves, blistering the bare skin of your feet and filling your lungs with heavy, scalding air. You look down beneath you as not a roaring crowd gathered around a standard wooden gallows, and it is not the traditional chopping block. Instead, suspended over a massive, roaring fire, sits a custom-forged iron cauldron of impossible size. The water inside is at a violent, rolling, apocalyptic boil. The executioner's hand rests heavily on a massive wooden winch. The heavy gears groan under your weight. You are about to be lowered into the water alive. This was the exact, unimaginable reality for a man in April of 1531. The location was Smithfield, the vast, open execution ground situated just outside the city walls of London. The air on this spring morning was thick with the smell of heavy wood smoke and a suffocating, unnatural terror. A massive crowd had gathered, pressing in tightly against the wooden barricades. These were hardened, cynical Londoners. They were citizens who regularly turned out to cheer at standard hangings and who viewed the brutal end of a criminal's life as public entertainment. But today, the crowd was deathly quiet. A heavy, collective unease settled over the square. They were completely unnerved by the sheer scale, the expense, and the deeply alien nature of the apparatus constructed before them. The cook thrashed wildly against his iron bindings, staring down at the steaming surface that was about to consume him. Why was he up there? Just weeks prior, he had poisoned the household of a prominent, highly connected bishop. Why was he facing this bizarre, unprecedented punishment? A brand new law, rushed into existence by the king himself, demanded it, and as he looked desperately around the platform, a darker realization set in. Where was the priest to offer his final rites? The man on the chain had been legally denied one. His soul was condemned to remain uncleansed before his violent end. The executioner firmly gripped the winch mechanism. The cook fought the iron, his sensory terror drowning out all reason. But beneath his physical dread lay a deeply unsettling, unanswered question. Why did the King of England completely rewrite the fundamental laws of nature and the church just to eliminate a lowly, uneducated kitchen servant? The heavy wooden gears snapped violently. The winch released. The heavy iron chain plummeted downward, and the cook's bare feet breached the surface of the boiling water. To understand how a man ends up suspended over a boiling vat, we must step back from the physical horror of the square and examine the cold, hard ink of history. The year is 1531. The apparatus of state control in England is shifting in dark, unprecedented ways. Parliament has just passed the Act for Poisoning, a legislative nightmare forced into existence by the sheer, unyielding will of the king. Before we uncover what the cook actually did to provoke this, we have to deeply examine the contemporary Tudor mindset. In the 16th century, poison was viewed with a uniquely profound, almost supernatural dread. It was the ultimate invisible weapon. Unlike a drawn sword or a hidden dagger, a toxin was entirely unseen. It required no physical strength to wield. It bypassed heavily fortified castle walls with ease. It slipped past highly trained royal guards without a single whisper. Most terrifyingly, it invaded the ultimate sanctuary, the dining hall, the hearth, and the communal act of breaking bread. According to the legal code of the era, ending a life was typically punished by a swift hanging, but the crown issued a harsh new decree. Poison was not merely a physical attack. It was a uniquely insidious threat to the entire social fabric. It was a violation of the deep, unspoken trust required to simply eat a meal in one's own home. Therefore, the crown argued, it required a uniquely horrific deterrent. The new parliamentary statute explicitly demanded a punishment that would shock the populace into absolute, unquestioning submission. If you are captivated by these deep dives into the hidden, darker corners of history, take a moment to subscribe and join us as we continue to unravel the chilling truths behind these sanitized historical narratives. As we analyze the legal documents and contemporary records from 1531, a glaring historical discrepancy immediately emerges from the archives. The official state narrative required a monster to justify this law. The legislation was ostensibly designed to crush political masterminds religious zealots, and foreign infiltrators seeking to dismantle the Tudor dynasty from the shadows. But the cook was none of these things. He was, by all surviving historical accounts, an absolute nobody. He had no powerful political affiliations. He possessed no hidden wealth. He harbored no grand ideological motive to strike at the church or the crown. The official Tudor state narrative loudly claimed he was a treasonous operator of the highest order. But the surviving evidence points to something much more disturbing, a terrifying, calculated overreach of royal power. If the cook was not a genuine political threat, what actually happened in that kitchen to trigger the apocalyptic wrath of a king? In Tudor England, the king's authority was absolute. His spoken word shaped reality, dictated religious doctrine, and commanded life and death across the realm. But beneath the heavy velvet and gold of the court, his vulnerability to the unseen was a closely guarded, deeply paralyzing secret. To grasp the crown's intense reaction to this specific event, we have to understand the deeply flawed medical science of the early 1530s. There was no forensics. There were no chemical tests to detect foreign substances in a cup of wine or a bowl of stew. Poison was effectively a ghost. It left behind no fingerprints, no physical entry wounds, only agonizing physical symptoms and a rapid contagion of panic. A sudden, violent illness could be a natural fever, a corrupted humor, or the quiet work of a hidden enemy. This profound medical ignorance collided violently with extreme, unprecedented political instability. In 1531, King Henry VIII was actively tearing the fabric of his country apart. His scandalous, protracted efforts to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and elevate Anne Boleyn to the throne had alienated his closest advisors. It had infuriated the Pope in Rome and deeply divided the powerful English nobility. Factions were actively plotting in the shadows. Whispers of rebellion echoed loudly in the corridors of power. Scholars now understand that the king's paranoia was reaching a dangerous peak. Henry did not merely want to punish one criminal for an isolated incident. He needed to fundamentally terrorize anyone who might dare use the invisible weapon against the crown during this highly vulnerable transition of power. He required a public spectacle so severe, so entirely contrary to the natural order, that the mere thought it would echo across generations. He needed to weaponize the legal system itself to project an aura of total invincibility. But a monarch cannot simply rewrite the fundamental, ancient laws of a nation without a catalyst. Before Henry could unleash this terrifying new form of state control, he needed a public excuse. And that excuse would not come from a massive foreign invasion or a grand, sweeping treasonous conspiracy. It began with a simple, bubbling pot of food. February 1531. We shift rapidly from the cold, calculating halls of absolute power to the stifling, chaotic heat of a Tudor hearth. The location is the sprawling, active kitchen of Bishop John Fisher's grand household in Lambeth. Fisher is a powerful, highly visible man. He is a staunch, unyielding defender of the old Catholic order and a vocal, dangerous opponent of the king's impending divorce. His home is a fortress of political opposition. But down in the kitchen, the high, sweeping politics of the realm are entirely absent. The air is thick with a heavy smell of roasting meat, boiling stock, and the relentless sweat of laborers moving quickly in confined spaces. The cook is moving frantically, exhausted by the relentless, daily demands of feeding the massive household. He is preparing a huge batch of pottage, a thick, hearty stew that will feed the bishop's extensive staff and any impoverished guests seeking alms at the gates. Sweating and deeply hurried, the cook reaches into his personal belongings for a pinch of white powder. He genuinely believes this unknown substance is a mild purgative. He intends to add it to the food of his fellow servants as a crude, mean-spirited kitchen prank. He simply wants to cause them intense digestive distress, to watch them suffer a few hours of extreme physical embarrassment as a dark joke. He stirs the powder deep into the massive, bubbling pot. The thick, boiling liquid swallows the white substance without a single trace. The rhythmic, heavy sound of boiling pottage eerily foreshadows the deadly, roaring cauldron that awaits him weeks later at Smithfield. The meal is ladled out and served. The servants and a few impoverished guests gather in the lower dining hall to eat their daily ration. The results are immediate, chaotic, and entirely catastrophic. 16 people collapse almost simultaneously mid-meal. The dining hall instantly descends into a visceral, inescapable nightmare. Men and women double over in sudden, agonizing pain. They are gripped by violent cramping, relentless internal purging, and a desperate, suffocating gasping for air. The cook watches from the periphery of the room. The color entirely drains from his face. He stands in sheer, paralyzing terror as the heavy reality of his mistake takes hold. This is not a prank. The powder was not a mild purgative. Amidst the screaming, the crying, and the complete collapse of order, two of the victims, a gentleman of the household and an impoverished widow, stop moving entirely. They pass away in absolute agony on the cold stone of the dining hall floor. His misguided joke has mutated instantly into a double tragedy. The bishop, who miraculously ate nothing that day, watches his household become a tomb. The heavily armed guards descend rapidly on the kitchen. They violently seize the cook, dragging him away from the hearth. As the cook is thrown into dark, solitary confinement, his mind races with the brutal, inevitable arithmetic of Tudor justice. He has ended 2 lives. He knows he will face a strict judge. He will be found guilty of taking life, and he will hang from the neck until his own life ends. It is a standard, fully expected consequence for a terrible, fatal action. He braces himself for the dark, solitary walk to the gallows. He is completely unaware that the news of this tainted pottage is already riding hard for the royal court, and his petty, fatal mistake has just caught the undivided attention of the king. We must now step back and examine the heavy, grinding machinery of the state law that was about to turn the cook into an example. In 1531, the legal path for someone accused of ending a life was clearly defined by centuries of established English common law. Dating back to the Magna Carta, a man accused of such a dark act would face a grand jury. If indicted, he would be tried publicly before a judge and a jury of his peers. He would have the basic right to speak in his own defense. If convicted, he would be sent to the traditional gallows. But as we dig deep into the parliamentary records of the era, a massive historical revelation completely reframes the entire opening sequence of this narrative. The screaming man suspended over the boiling vat at Smithfield was not a convicted criminal in the eyes of courts. The cook was never put on trial. He never saw the inside of a courtroom. He never stood before a judge. He never faced a jury of his peers. Instead, the king executed a dark, brilliant, and utterly devastating legal maneuver. He utilized a rare, heavy mechanism known as an Act of Attainder. Contemporary records show that the king bypassed the entire judicial system. Parliament, bending completely to the powerful monarch's will, passed a specific legislative act that simply declared the cook guilty by royal decree. A single piece of parchment, signed by the monarch, completely erased a citizen's fundamental right to defend his own existence. The Act of Attainder did not merely declare him guilty of the loss of life. It retroactively reclassified his crime. The state officially declared that because poison was an invisible, inherently treacherous weapon, its very use constituted high treason against the realm itself. By officially elevating a botched kitchen prank to the ultimate level of high treason, the king legally justified a punishment previously unknown to English law: absolute destruction by boiling water. Furthermore, the newly drafted statute contained a specific clause that was deeply, psychologically terrifying to the 16th century mind. It explicitly stripped the condemned of the benefit of clergy. In a deeply religious society where the afterlife was an absolute certainty, this meant the cook was denied a final confession. He was denied absolution. He was permanently denied the sacred spiritual rites required to cleanse his soul before his end. The state was not merely ending his physical body. It was effectively dooming his eternal soul by royal decree. The horrifying truth of the era suddenly snaps into sharp focus. The cook was never a genuine prisoner of justice. He was a legally defenseless lab rat. The crown had found a perfect, politically insignificant subject to test drive an absolute, terrifying weapon of state control. Condemned to an agonizing end by a single piece of paper, the cook is dragged violently from his cell and handed over directly to the dark, waiting hands of the state's interrogators. Deep beneath the heavy, fortified walls of the Tower of London, the cold, damp stone absorbs every sound of human suffering. It is early 1531, and the cook is submerged in a deeply claustrophobic nightmare. He is currently being subjected to the king's interrogation, a systemic dismantling of his physical body until his spirit completely breaks. The sensory details of the subterranean chamber are suffocating. There's a bitter, biting chill of cold iron against bare skin, the heavy, rhythmic creaking of a wooden mechanism stretching human joints to their absolute limit, and the sharp, undeniable scent of copper and terror sweat hanging heavy in the air. The cook weeps openly in the dim light, his mind fracturing under the physical pressure. He confesses, repeatedly and desperately, to the dark figures operating the machinery that it was all a terrible, tragic mistake. He begs his captors to understand his true intent. He swears on his eternal soul that the white powder was merely a kitchen prank meant to cause sickness, never to end a life. But as his desperate voice echoes off the unyielding stone, a deeply terrifying reality slowly dawns on him. The state's interrogators simply do not care about his truth. His actual, verifiable intent in the bishop's kitchen is entirely irrelevant to the state's grand political goals. They only care about validating the king's new, sweeping narrative of widespread treason. Battered, completely broken, and unable to fight the relentless machinery of the Tudor state, the cook is finally pulled from the mechanism. He is coldly informed of his final sentence. He is told he will not see the traditional wooden gallows, nor will he feel the swift, relatively merciful strike of an executioner's axe. He will be boiled. It is a punishment so deeply alien, so profoundly incomprehensible to a lowly Tudor cook, that the mere words shatter his remaining sanity. How does a civilized state even go about boiling a man alive? To understand what it actually means to boil a human being, we must step back from the damp, agonizing stones of the tower and examine the dark physiological and historical mechanics of this nightmare. We know from examining the broader European legal codes of the era that boiling was occasionally utilized on the continent. However, it was almost exclusively reserved for extreme counterfeiters, criminals who fundamentally undermined a nation's currency by shaving coins or forging heavy metals. The Tudor king specifically imported, codified, and legally weaponized this agonizing method for poisoners in England. The medical reality of this newly drafted punishment is staggering. When a human body is subjected to a violent, rolling boil, the destruction of peripheral nerve endings is absolute. However, because the state designed the apparatus to lower the victim's feet first, the brain and vital organs are kept safely above the water initially. This grim physiological fact ensures an agonizing, extended duration of pure consciousness as the water slowly overtakes the system. The victim remains acutely, inescapably aware of their own physical destruction as massive systemic shock begins to shut down the organs one by one. The state essentially engineered a method of execution that maximized the duration of agony while keeping the victim mathematically alive for as long as scientifically possible. In the weeks following the rapid passage of the act for poisoning, the massive, custom iron cauldron is hastily forged in the city's heavy industrial sectors. The heavy lifting chains are rigorously tested for weight and strain. The legal and mechanical preparations are complete, and the unprecedented day of execution finally arrives. April 5th, 1531. We return to the suffocating terror of the Smithfield execution grounds, but now we carry the crushing, inescapable weight of the legal and medical context. The cook, completely defenseless and stripped of all human dignity, is lowered slowly into the roaring, boiling water. The comforting, everyday motif of the bubbling kitchen cooking pot, the very hearth he once commanded, reaches its absolute, horrific climax in the center of London. Contemporary Tudor chroniclers, standing amidst the terrified crowd that day, recorded the auditory nightmare with chilling simplicity. They documented that the condemned cook was roaring mighty loud. The visceral, psychological horror of the event rapidly escalates as the state flexes its newfound power. To artificially prolong his suffering and ensure the maximum visual impact for the king's new law, the executioner does not let him simply submerge and pass away quickly. The cook is repeatedly pulled up by the heavy wooden winch. He is left gasping in the cold spring air, his body failing, before being slowly, deliberately lowered down into the boiling depths once again. The massive crowd of hardened Londoners, citizens completely accustomed to the brutal sights of standard public punishments, cannot bear the spectacle. They turn their faces away in hundreds, physically and morally sickened by the sights and smells radiating from the colossal iron vat. The cook thrashes violently against his heavy iron chains, screaming endlessly without the comfort of a priest to guide him. His physical body is systematically dissolving, and his soul is eternally damned by royal decree. He expires in unimaginable, protracted torment. The king has made his terrifying point. The water finally goes still, but the psychological damage to the country has just begun. The physical fallout of the execution at the square is immediate and overwhelming. A heavy, dark stench hangs over the city of London for days, a constant, physical reminder of the crown's absolute authority. But the deep psychological stain left on the English legal system is far worse. The sheer, unprecedented brutality of the act deeply disturbed the populace and nobility alike. The act for poisoning successfully terrified the realm in the short term, but we must look at the immediate legal aftermath to understand its true failure as a lasting deterrent. The legislation was viewed by legal scholars and the public as so fundamentally abhorrent, so deeply contrary to the ancient, sacred traditions of English common law, that it simply could not survive the king who created it. Under the monarch's young son, the new king, the punishment of boiling was swiftly and permanently repealed. The dark law was physically struck from the books, deemed far too extreme and entirely tyrannical even for a notoriously brutal and unforgiving age. The massive custom-built iron cauldrons across the realm were hastily dismantled, melted down, and repurposed for standard industrial use. The specific, engineered nightmare of death by boiling was deliberately erased from the justice system. History actively tried to sanitize the brutal memory of the event by destroying the physical evidence of the cauldron. But a much darker, much quieter disease had already deeply infected the English legal system, waiting dormant for the crown to use it again. The fires beneath the vats were permanently extinguished, and the boiling stopped forever, but the true legal nightmare survived and flourished in the halls of power. The central, unresolved question that hung over the entire spectacle, why use a lowly, uneducated cook to completely rewrite the laws of the land, is finally answered in full. The cook was never meant to be a grand, treasonous villain. He was a carefully selected trial balloon. The paranoid king had successfully proven to his political rivals that the crown could boldly use a bill of attainder to eradicate a human being without a trial, without a jury, and without a single word of legal defense. We can now reveal the chilling, long-term legacy of that fatal kitchen mistake. Having successfully tested this devastating legal weapon on an insignificant nobody, the monarch would go on to use the exact same parliamentary mechanism to bypass the courts entirely in the years to come. He would use it to systematically eradicate his most powerful political enemies, to silence his religious rivals, and eventually to legally eliminate his own wives. The true, enduring horror of the cook's case isn't the roaring fire, the blistering heat, or the massive iron cauldron. It is the terrifying legal precedent left behind in the ashes of the execution square. The cook wasn't just a kitchen servant who made a tragically fatal mistake with a pinch of white powder. He was a legally defenseless, blood-soaked key that the king used to unlock a terrifying era of absolute, unchecked tyranny. If you found this deep dive into the dark, erased mechanisms of Tudor history compelling, please take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments what sanitized historical nightmare we should investigate next. We will see you in the next chapter of the Erased Archives.